Hey everyone, 大家好. This episode's about a piece of online smut that exploded into print to both fanfare and controversy. 50 Shades of Grey, or a Chinese equivalent? No, not really. A Xi Jinping fanfic? It's not that either. It's a completely different beast altogether, and yes, it's definitely a beast. But what's the nature of the beast? Well, let's find out. So our translated fiction today is a novel. The English name is Leave Me Alone. If you haven't heard of that, it's by Murong Xuecun. Got its Chinese name here in front of me. Pardon me if I get the tones wrong. Chengdu Jinye Qingjiang Wo Yiwang. Yep, I wasn't probably massacred that. But that Chinese name means Chengdu, please forget me tonight, or tonight please forget me. So the English name actually has a fuller form, Leave Me Alone, a novel of Chengdu. So they've kept the Chengdu in there, but it's more of a subtitle, I suppose, and it's not printed on the cover. I think it's on the half title of the book. It's on the kind of title page inside the cover. So so we got Leave Me Alone, the English name, and the Chinese name Chengdu, Please Forget Me Tonight, which to me sounds a little bit more sad and fatalistic compared with the English language title. To me, I think that sounds a bit more aggressive. I think both certainly work because the novel has a kind of a fatalism, a feeling that no matter what you do, nothing can go right. Definitely some elements of like depression and defeat. But there's the protagonist and a lot of the people he encounters are absolutely full of aggression and kind of do want to be left alone, maybe on an existential level. So both titles work. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about the author, Murong Xuecun. So he's a bit like our last author, Wang Shuo. In fact, he's kind of a lot like him. He uses a pen name, so Murong Xuecun. If you can count, you'll know that's 4 characters, and Chinese names basically can't or don't, or I think there's perhaps some exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, you don't see 4-character Chinese names. They're always 2 characters or 3, always 1 for the family name, I think. Perhaps there's some exceptions. And then 1 or 2 for the given name. So Murong Xuecun's real name is Hao Chun, although I should also point out that on my English language edition here, his author's name, or his name, is just written as Murong. They don't include the Xuecun on the front cover or on the spine, but on the blurb, let me see. Actually, I don't see his name on the blurb apart from, and the quotes, except as Mr. Murong or Murong. Yeah, so even on the back here, we don't have Murong Xuecun. Let me have a look inside. Yeah, unless you went looking really hard, and even in this physical book, he's just Murong. We don't have his full pen name. So another thing that Murong has in common with Wang Shuo is that he was also offered a position and a salary in the Chinese Writers Association, this state organization that kind of lends a support and keeps an eye on Chinese writers. But just like Wang Shuo, Murong turned that down. So before he became a writer, Murong was working in the 90s and the early 2000s, and at that time Chinese economy was still burgeoning, still growing very fast, and still kind of in the process of what's called reform and opening up in the government's own English translation of their words. That's what they called it. So it was a pretty vibrant, you could say, time in the Chinese economy, but also, just like when Western countries massively liberalized themselves in the 80s and 90s, kind of greed got unleashed, and perhaps it was a more extreme kind of thing in China because it was a much more extreme transition from a very state-controlled economy to a liberalized one. So Murong was working in a pharmaceutical company in the big southern economic powerhouse city of Guangzhou. The company was called Softo, at least that's its English name, and he discovered that Softo had an online forum where its workers could self-publish prose and poetry. So this would be a Chinese language forum on the Chinese interwebs. And he quite liked it. He was reading there a lot. And he finally saw a web novel on that self-publishing prose and poetry forum called Our Beijing. And it was in a style that he really liked. And he thought he could do something similar himself and probably get a following, just like some of these other writers on the forum were doing. So in the year 2002, Murong Xuecun, formerly known as Xuecun, and I suppose perhaps still known as Xuecun to his friends, gave it a go. So Murong posted Chengdu Forget Me Tonight, or Leave Me Alone as it's become known in the English-speaking world, piece by piece onto the internet in the year 2002, and he quickly built up a following. He was using short, punchy chapters stuffed with anger, frustration, cursing, beer, food. I remember tofu in particular and hot pot, since it's a Chengdu novel. And there was a lot of sex too, which of course helps people turn the proverbial virtual pages. Clearly things were going well, because before he'd even finished posting all the pieces of this web novel, a quote cleaned up unquote version was published in print by the Inner Mongolia People's Publishing House. So there's quite a lot of these publishing houses in China named after different provinces and cities. They're, I think, mostly, if not all, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and it's interesting that the Inner Mongolia publishing SOE picked up this novel, because of course it's a novel of Chengdu, and as far as Chengdu's in Sichuan, as far as I'm aware, Inner Mongolia and Sichuan province don't even touch borders. But yeah, what do I know about this? Not much. Anyway, after it got published by these guys, the novel was also picked up by another Chinese publisher called the 21st Century Publishing House, and then another Chinese publisher called Epoch Publishing. So this was one of the really first big web novel success stories in China, and it was well ahead of anything we've seen in the West, certainly quite far ahead of 50 Shades of Grey. So in 2008 and 2009, some slightly crappy-looking, in my opinion, French and German editions of Leave Me Alone or Chengdu Forget Me Tonight appeared. So the French one was 2008, the German one was 2009. And this was kind of happening just as Murong's relationship with, let's just say, the Chinese state was kind of reaching its best, and then not much longer further along the line, it's worst. But we'll talk a bit more about that later. Let's not make everything about politics, I think there's enough of that out there. So in the year 2009, an Australian publisher, so an English language publisher, obviously, Allen and Unwin, published Chengdu Forget Me Tonight under the name Leave Me Alone. So this is when the name Leave Me Alone first appeared. And this edition, it's not the one I've got. I've got the UK-US edition, but it's got, and it does not have the same cover, but it's clearly got the same design. It's got a kind of edgy, modern font in a slightly murky-looking green colour that I really like. Yeah. And it's the same translator, Harvey Tomlinson. The main difference is the Allen and Unwin edition has a completely different picture on the cover. It's a picture of like a Chengdu evening scene. There's a lady on a phone, whereas my UK-US edition, it's a close-up of some slightly rotten-looking flowers, which both fit the novel, but I think the rotten flowers are kind of a more powerful, potent image that link up with the themes of the novel, whereas a picture of a Chengdu night scene, it's a bit more literal, and it's just not quite such a pleasing image. It's a nice photo, perhaps, but doesn't really fit as a book cover. I've only seen a graphic of it on a computer screen. I haven't seen it, the physical book. But yeah, it just didn't look as professional to me. But if someone from Allen and Unwin is listening, by all means, send an assassin to my house and silence me. I'm not afraid of you. So, a word on the translator of this book. He's called Harvey Tomlinson. So, as you can probably guess, he's not Chinese. He's got a company based in Hong Kong called Make Do, which is involved in the translation and publication of Chinese writers and has also published some Westerners writing about China. Now, an intriguing thing, which I could not quite get to the bottom of, is that my copy of Leave Me Alone was published by a company called 46, and the evidence I could find online suggests that 46 may have turned into Make Do, or it may be an imprint of Make Do, a word for kind of like a publishing term for like a company within a company or a brand within a company. So perhaps Make Do purchased 46. It is not clear to me. Couldn't find the answer. Need to ask someone. And here we go on a tangent. The person I might ask could be Nikki Harman. She's she's another Western translator of Chinese to English fiction. She runs an organization and a website called Paper Republic, which is an amazing resource that I'm making use of, and you could too if such things interest you. I met her yesterday. This is why I'm on this tangent. I was at the London Book Fair and I had a chat with her about this podcast, and she's very enthused because she agrees it's a niche. There are podcasts on Chinese literature, but specifically like looking at the translation angle, yeah. So we might have her on one day once I'm more professional and ready for her. Tangent over. Expect more about the London Book Fair in the next episode. So yes, Harvey Tomlinson's translation of Leave Me Alone is honestly, I think it's fab. The prose is pretty corrosive. The dialogue does feel kind of tough, hard-boiled from the street. I'm sure that's how Murong Xuecun wrote this book. But in any case, Harvey Tomlinson got the vibe that was required. My one criticism of him is, Harvey, your website, Make Do's website, it looks a bit unfinished. There's some dead links, perhaps from a previous version of the site, and some slightly underfilled pages that look like they're not finished. So yeah. Shots fired. Big shots fired from a guy who doesn't work nearly as hard as you, Harvey. Take that. Oh yes, one last thing. So Make Do, or /46, I think it was under the name 46, Harvey's apparently company, published another book I had read a couple of years, I think, before I read Leave Me Alone, called China Cuckoo, which is by written in English by a English/Welsh guy about his experiences in China, which means it kind of doesn't fit within the parameters of this podcast. But yeah, pretty cool book, worth checking out, guys. Interesting stuff. China Cuckoo by Mark Kitto. Yeah. So, pressing on, let's talk about the edition of Leave Me Alone that I'm reading. I am reading the 2014 UK edition, or rather, I've read the 2014 UK edition put out by 46. So I'm pretty sure this is the full novel. Remember I said before that the Chinese editions of Leave Me Alone, the Chinese print editions of Leave Me Alone were slightly cleaned up and censored, whereas the Chinese web novel, the original version, was not chopped up. So pretty sure we're reading a translation of the uncensored version, but I have nothing to back that up. That just seems more likely to me. I don't recall what they were, but I do recall reading through it, there were some typos. Perhaps the proofreading was a little rushed or underfunded. Again, I did not make notes of those as I was reading it. I read it just around Christmas. But yeah, the typography and the layout and the design of this edition, I loved it. The front cover is gorgeous. It's like a dark red, crimson colour palette, murky green title with a slightly kind of chaotic looking font. At each chapter, they've got a wee, I don't know the right technical word here, there's a little illustration of little mahjong tiles, which the sleazy themes of the book, and mahjong being this like very casual late night gambling sport, fits perfectly. So design, typography, layout wise, it's a cool edition. It was a feast for my eyes. It also has a wee quote on the page facing the copyrights from Murong. It doesn't give a context for his quote, but I like it quite a lot. It's not the deepest thing you've ever heard. I'll just read it to you now. In times such as these, the best thing you can do is to make sure that you don't do bad things and try to live a virtuous life. Yeah, I'm not going to analyze that. I'm just going to let it sit in your memory, and then you can measure it against either what you feel when you read this book or what sense you get from my synopsis. If it so happens you're never going to read Leave Me Alone, which, by the way, you don't have to. No one's going to judge you for that. No one needs to know. I certainly won't unless you reach out and tell me. Yes, one more thing about the kind of layout of this book. This ties into the mystery of, is 46 the company that became Make Do? So on the very, very, very last page facing the back cover, it just says, bang in the middle of the page, I think, www.46.tv, and that's a dead link. That doesn't go anywhere. 404 error. So I can't analyze that. It's just intriguing, and I would like to find out what the story is about 46 and Make Do. So, yes, here is a question that came to me when I was thinking about how I would, share all my deep takes and my hot cuts, or hot takes, deep cuts, deep dives, my thoughts about the book anyway. I was thinking, is this another piece of Liumang Wenshui, Liumang literature, Liumang being the Mandarin word for hooligan, just like Wang Shuo's books, basically. In fact, I think Wang Shuo's books were the only ones that were really considered examples of Liumang literature. But I think this book kind of fits that mold. I'm going to give the argument for and against considering Leave Me Alone as Liumang hooligan literature. So the case for this is an urban book, just like the deeply, intensely urban environments that Wang Shuo writes about. It's from a very male perspective, and I think you certainly could have a female Liumang protagonist, but I don't think that's what's going on in Wang Shuo's book. And Leave Me Alone, I've got to say, I think it's even more aggressively masculine, toxically. It's got the kind of dark or painful or violent, all these kind of dark sides of masculinity are in this book. It's spicy, and I'm not going to explain what I mean by that. It's a spicy book, and I think Wang Shuo perhaps is too, but spice levels are higher here, because this is Chengdu literature, this is Sichuan literature. Moving on, another reason for this being a Liumang book is it's kind of cool. The characters kind of live an edgy, kind of beatnik lifestyle. So Liumangs are cool. We have some Liumangs, or at least some cool guys in Leave Me Alone. Another case for criminality and the edge of the law. So these characters in Leave Me Alone are definitely breaking the law quite a lot, often with corruption, public violence. I don't know what Chinese laws are about public violence, but yeah, these guys are outside and on the edge of the law in their personal and business and perhaps sex lives. Again, don't know what the laws are in China. And a point on criminality. So Murong himself, in a quote I'm going to give in full later, described himself as a criminal with words, although in context it's a little bit more of a ironic statement. So yes, Liumang literature, criminality. There's another point for this being a Liumang book. The next argument for this being Liumang literature, it's politically disinterested, it's ambivalent. So there was a strong political and critical dimension to Please Don't Call Me Human, the book in the last episode by Wang Shuo. This one's even more disinterested. Wang Shuo's book, yes, it was political. Did it come down hard in favor of making any particular argument for something different? No. And Leave Me Alone, it highlights corruption, yes, in the world of business and in the police. Is it a political book? No, I don't think so at all. I think it's a piece of maybe social criticism about greed and moral laxity that came up with the opening of the Chinese economy, but I don't think it's shooting at any political figures. It's just kind of an exercise in despair, nastiness. Yeah. So I think that fits the Liu Mang model. And the last point for the black humor. So that book we read by Wang Shuo, Please Don't Call Me Human, was, I would say, a very, very black comedy with a strong element of absurdism. Leave Me Alone. There are quite a lot of funny, kind of like cringy situations almost. Some of the situations the protagonist Chen Zhong gets himself into are like, you're just shaking your head, like, man, why are you doing this to yourself? So maybe the humor here is not black, but the kind of darker, more despairing humor is perhaps something that we could argue for being a trait of Liu Mang literature, present in Leave Me Alone. But now I'm going to give the argument against why this is maybe a completely different creature from Wang Shuo's writing. So first up, sour and bitter. Just like spicy, I'm not going to explain what these mean. just to be annoying. Another reason this isn't a Liu Mang book, it's just very black and nihilistic. So like, there was maybe a certain degree of strong moral or general indifference in the Wang Shuo book I read, and from what I read about his other writings. But here, this book, Leave Me Alone by Murong, it's just bleak as hell. It kind of depicts life as hell. Certainly the life you can make, the hell you can create for yourself just by following your blind instincts rather than being a sensible person. I've got a quote here from one of Murong's longtime editors, who's kind of, both from a business perspective of trying to get the books published, but perhaps also just a concern about his friend. So this editor, Lu Jimbo, said of Murong, he is the best writer under the age of 40, but Murong has one problem. His writings are too dark. I think he also said he's a nihilist loner. Also a quote from Lu Jimbo. So if your editor's disturbed by you, perhaps you have a problem. But then again, if Murong wasn't super dark and nihilist and kind of a self-determined loner, would his writing have the edge it does? No, probably not. So, yeah. Isn't life unfair that you, sometimes it's your flaws or your problems that give you the edge? Deep cut. Alright, another argument for this not being a Liu Mang book. Our protagonist, Chen Zhong, he's managerial. He's working in an SOE. It's a petroleum, or petroleum? I'll say petroleum. He's working in a petroleum company. And you could say some of his problems are like, oh, my chair just collapsed, are like corporate problems. He's an alcoholic. He has addictive tendencies. He's self-destructive. And I'm not sure if Liu Mang, like a cool guy, Wang Shuo protagonist, would be this messed up or wearing a suit to work. So perhaps for this reason, it's not a Liu Mang book. And perhaps just the last reason why this is perhaps not in the same mold as Wang Shuo, it's from a different era. Wang Shuo's kind of began writing in the 80s, continued through to the 90s. And although the 90s were perhaps formative years for Murong, his books are more of an early 2000s phenomenon. Or at least that was when he really hit his... Well, no, maybe not early 2000s, but I think the previous decade from the one we're in now was probably the era of Murong Xuecun. So perhaps the Liu Mang moment was a moment, and perhaps it's over, and I shouldn't be trying to tack that label somewhere where it doesn't belong. Yeah, there you go. Analysis. So another thought I have about this book is a question I asked myself. Does the kind of online medium or format that the book began as affect the form of its print edition? I don't know what went on in the editing process, but I would say, yeah, the print edition does have a structure that I think is probably informed by the web format. So remember I said that Murong was publishing it just piece by piece, and his followers were waiting for each piece post by post. And I think it makes the book read a bit like the one Charles Dickens novel I've read, Great Expectations. So it's super readable. It has short, punchy, dramatic chapters. They often end on cliffhangers. That's the plus side. The negative side is perhaps the plot meanders a bit. Perhaps it wasn't totally planned out piece by piece. Gets a bit repetitive maybe. And then when it ends, it does end nicely, but it kind of just ends when it ends abruptly. I would say that there's some like proper character development and progression throughout the plot. Because the plot is like it's just Chen Zhong consistently being dishonest and angry and screwing himself over whenever he tries to get at other people. But the progression is that he does kind of, his despair and regret gradually increases, perhaps doesn't reach a climax, and there's no kind of final moment of realization. Perhaps that would be too cheesy, but he does kind of gradually learn things about himself. He sees what he's doing wrong. He gets a sense of just how and why he's become what he's become. So yeah, that I would say is the progression of the novel beyond just kind of a downward spiral into alcohol and stupid behavior. So I'm going to read you some excerpts from the novel now, just to give you a flavour of what goes on in this story, rather than giving you a plot summary, which you could read online. So here's page 1, the very start of the novel. My wife called as I was leaving the office to ask if I wanted to join her at some new hot pot restaurant everyone was talking about. All you think about is eating, I snapped. I was pissed off because Fatty Dong had just been appointed general manager. Fatty and I started selling car parts in the company's Chengdu branch at about the same time. All he was good at was sucking up to people, but from now on, that idiot was going to be my boss. If you don't want to come, said Zhao Yue, then shall I ask someone else? Does it sound like I'm bothered? She cut me off before I'd even finished. For a while, I stared blankly into space. Zhao Yue hadn't done anything wrong, but I wasn't going to take any shit tonight. Snatching up my leather briefcase, I stormed out of the building like thunder. So here we just get, for the very first sentence, it mentions hot pot, so we know where we are. But yeah, we get a sense of what a moody guy, angry guy, this Chen Zhong is, and kind of the vibe I get from this very first opener is leave me alone. That's why I think the English translation of the Chinese title is so good. Okay, I'm going to read from page 151 now. This is one of the party/drinking scenes, one of many, many, many. The Chen Zhong and his pals are out for the night, and here's a little snippet of something pretty typical from one of those scenes. Big Head Wang said hurriedly, Drink, drink. Tonight, no one is allowed to talk about anything bad. I won't allow it. I'd always dismissed Big Head as a non-entity. The strange thing was, though, in all these years, nothing bad had ever really happened to him. He'd never taken a wrong turn in life. Aside from pure luck, he must possess some life wisdom. Li Liang said he was the Monkey King dressed up as Pig. Big Head Wan looked embarrassed by this. I'm not like you, he said. I don't set my sights too high. As long as I have something to drink during the day and someone to grope at night, then I'm happy. I had heard that he was pushing hard for another promotion to procurement manager, a famously lucrative post. Li Liang said enviously, It's easier for you to make money than me. There's no risk, and you don't even have to use your brain. Yeah, so in that clip we had casual sexism, we had greed, we had hustling, we had drinking. Yeah, what else did we have there? Yeah, basically all our elements, or some of our key elements of the kind of flavour of Leave Me Alone. And here we've got page 209. It's the start of a chapter where Chen Zhong is starting to feel kind of the biting, deep, bleak sadness kind of weigh on him. He's had kind of an encounter with his wife who's in the process of leaving him, and he's feeling crushed by his own misdeeds. He's probably in the process of learning it's his own misdeeds that have done this. So here we go. The skin on my hands peeled every autumn. Western doctors blamed a vitamin deficiency, and Chinese doctors said that it was too much heat in my blood. Zhao Yue claimed that I had been a snake in my past life. Had I watched this passing scene from a remote cave in the mountains? Love and hate, sorrow and happiness. Would this life that for Buddhists was a compound of hundreds of accumulated lives be like the skin on my hands, flaking away bit by bit in the cold autumn? Yeah, that's probably why Murong's author thinks he's the best of his generation. It's just cracking stuff. So sadness aside, let's give this book a rating. I would give it 5 out of 5 servings of cold beer and hot tofu because, I think the only flaw I would, in my opinion, is maybe that the plot isn't as tight as it could be. At points it feels like a tone poem because it's just ridiculous scene after ridiculous scene. But it's such an enjoyable read and often so well put together, I suppose, in the original composition and the translation. So kudos to both the author and the translator. The book might not be to your liking if you just don't want endless debauchery or this level of debauchery, or if you want some guiding moral principles or a shred of light. Might not be the book for you, but on a personal level, 5 out of 5 angry guys in a shirt and a suit. 5 out of 5 promiscuous KTV sessions. Right, so I said earlier that I would talk about Murong's relationship with the state, and we could infer from that censorship, given the kind of the content of his novels. So here's a story about a Jiangxi pyramid scheme, a speech, the editor Lu Jinbo, and Murong's sadness. I have a big section of a speech he gave. I was planning on reading the whole thing. I think that would be a stretch. Suffice to say, the whole speech exists online in English. I think the New York Times, I know I dissed them in the last episode, they had some really good resources on Murong. I think they had him into their office for a video interview one time. So anyway, on with the story. On with the true story. In 2009, Murong Xuecun wrote an exposé on a pyramid scheme in China's Jiangxi province, and he called it China in the Absence of a Remedy, or I have the Chinese here, 中国少了一味药. Again, apologies if I mispronounced that. And for this exposé, he won the 2010 People's Literature Prize, and he wrote a 4,000 word, a dramatic, let's say, 4,000 word acceptance speech. But when it came time to give it, he basically was told not to, so he just made a zipping motion with his mouth on the stage and then proceeded to publish the thing online. I'm just going to read one paragraph for it, and then I urge you to look up the rest if you're interested in Murong. So here's what he said. I have dedicated great effort to the task of compiling this sensitive words glossary, and I've mastered my filtering skills. I knew which words and sentences had to be cut, and I accepted the cutting as if that was the way it should be. In fact, I will often take it on myself to save time and cut a few words. I call this castrated writing. I'm a provocative eunuch. I've already castrated myself before the surgeon raises his scalpel. And I mentioned earlier that Murong called himself a word criminal, so I'll just read the context of that quote. It's also from the speech. So I'll try and do this fairly quickly. The most unfortunate thing is that despite my experience, I still don't always know which words are legal and which illegal, and as a result, I often unknowingly commit a word crime. Last night, I saw an advertisement in Beijing that said, "What will you say if you become a world champion?" Here's my answer. I'm a writer. It is difficult to call myself a writer, even when I stand at a podium to receive a prize. I feel uncomfortable calling myself a writer. I am merely a word criminal. So yeah, provocative, and I think it's interesting not knowing what's allowed and what's not allowed, because in a way that's more oppressive than knowing exactly what's not allowed, because it leaves you guessing and it makes you self-censor rather than actively being censored by an outside force. I'm sure if you go around looking, people have plenty to say about that in China, in both writing and other kinds of conduct. So yeah, if you like these two quotes, go look up the full speech. It's a good read. So a couple of final remarks on Murong and his kind of trials and tribulations in publishing. So he did publish more books after Chengdu, Forget Me Tonight, or Leave Me Alone, a novel of Chengdu. He and his publishers actually found a way to get around censorship, kind of a publishing model that worked for him. So what he would do is he would publish the full online text piece by piece for free for his adoring fans and to build up reputation and following and so on. And then he would make money, he and his publisher would make money with a censored or cleaned up print version, self-censored, I suppose, or partly self-censored, I don't know the exact details. And then once that first censored edition of the book had been cleared, then apparently they would get a new edition out because the book had kind of been tick-boxed. And in that new edition, they would go for a more complete version, akin to how the book was published online, uncensored. So that's what I learned, I think, on the interview, the quotes in the New York Times article about Murong. Seems interesting. I didn't get any second sources to verify it, but yeah, definitely an interesting loophole in the kind of system of control in Chinese publishing. So speaking of censorship and control, if you go looking for Murong's Sina Weibo account, Weibo is, I'm sure you may have heard before, that's like Chinese Twitter basically, but it's probably, I think it's more used more by your average person than Twitter is, because China doesn't really have a Facebook. I suppose Weibo is kind of like the Twitter and the Facebook in some ways. Anyway, Murong's Weibo account is gone. It's got the kind of generic message saying there's something abnormal in this account and it has been removed until further notice, which basically means somebody's took it down. So I don't know what the future holds for Murong Xuecun. He's certainly had his success. I'm sure he's made his money and he's found acclaim domestically and abroad. So our next episode's going to be a wee bit different. I'm not necessarily going to be analysing any translated Chinese texts. I'm going to be talking about what I kind of saw and heard at the London Book Fair, which is the UK publishing industry's biggest get-together. Well, you may not be surprised to hear, I basically went looking for every Chinese publishing company that I could, and I also went looking for I went looking for a translator called Jeremy Tian, who's Singaporean, fluent in English and Chinese, has written his own books, I think in English, and has translated others' work from Chinese into English. I had a chat with him, and I met Nikki Harman, as I mentioned earlier, and I also spoke to some very nice people from both state-owned enterprises and at least one private Chinese company called Web Novel, who they are super interesting. I might in the future be looking at some of their translated fiction, which is going to be also a little bit like Murong from the internet, but a lot more like the internet fan fiction that is the norm now, like genre, what you could call it trashy if you wanted. So lots of interesting things coming up in the next episode, and a bit more of a personal episode, as I'll be talking about my findings and my fun times trying to network and hand out little business cards with the name of this podcast on them. So on that note, goodbye, 再见, and hope you stick around for episode 4 of the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. 就像那里翻腾的喧嚣，繁星在梦里闪耀。